everyone. It's great to be here with you today and to be talking to you about an important topic, regulating technology. It's a transatlantic conversation. So when you think about regulating technology, about questions of innovation, consumer welfare come up always, privacy and disinformation as well, tough problems in the world of big platforms. And in fact, a lot of activity on both sides of the Atlantic. We just saw this morning, when this is being recorded on April 5th, that Justice Thomas of the Supreme Court came out with an interesting statement stating that it is unprecedented, the concentrated control of so much speech in the hands of a few private parties. We will soon have no choice but to address how our legal doctrines apply to highly concentrated, privately owned information infrastructure, such as digital platforms. Well, both sides of the Atlantic are working on this question. And so we're with some differences and possibly some convergence. We'll learn more about that here in a minute. We are joined today by two fabulous experts. First, Rob Atkinson. He is the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, right in our sweet spot of this conversation. He has served as an advisor to 4 presidents. Is it 5 yet, Rob?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right.
Well, no, I advised the Biden campaign, so I guess that's
there you go. Well, we'll say 5 then, on a bipartisan basis. So he's a widely respected American commentator on these topics and writer. Also joining us, Rob, is, I assume you're in Washington, Rob?
That's correct.
Great. Okay. And Marina is joining us from Tallinn, Estonia. She's a member of the European Parliament from Estonia, or as they say, Estonia. And we worked together when she was chairing the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace. So she has a deep background in some of these issues. Also the former foreign minister of Estonia and ambassador to the United States. So she has an understanding of the transatlantic partnership as well. I am Bruce McConnell. I'm the president of the EastWest Institute, which is transitioning out of its current form, and our cyber security cooperation program has gone to ORF, Observer Research Foundation America, which is the new US affiliate of Observer Research Foundation, and I'm proud to be a distinguished fellow there. All righty, well, with that, let's just kick off. Rob, you want to kick us off here with some views on the current landscape and whatnot, and then we'll hear from Marina and get into some conversation.
Oh, sure. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Bruce and Marina. Always long admired Estonia or Estonia. I think I might hold the copyright to that because I had that name about 8 years ago when I was in Brussels. So whatever. So I think this is a pretty important issue, but it's also one that gets so conflated and so convoluted. What are we actually talking about here? Because tech is much, much bigger than social media platforms. Amazon's not really a social media platform. They're a retailer. Apple's not really a social media platform. They're a cell phone, entertainment, all that. So we have to be careful what we're talking about. Is Intel in this bucket? They're a semiconductor company. They're in the IT space. So when we hear these sort of broad frames, we have to regulate tech. I don't know what it means, really. I think we have to be much more careful and strategic and targeted. I assume most of what we're going to talk about today is our internet platforms that people engage with every day, and that do have some power, market power, just because of their size. The second thing is, I think we have to. There's always that sort of statement that you're supposed to use the right tool for the right job, and I feel like that gets so confused on here. People want to use antitrust to deal with privacy issues. Privacy is not a tech issue. I really resent when I go to Europe and I have to, and I get all these restrictions on what I do digitally. But when I go check into my hotel, I don't get to opt out of my hotel data. Maybe I do, but I don't know how to do it. Privacy applies to all sorts of things: your hotels, your grocery stores, your government. It's not just a narrow GAFA issue, if you will. So I think, again, we have to distinguish that. I think if we're talking about speech, then we have to talk about particular kinds of interventions. If we're talking about privacy, it's a separate kind, but it should be applying to all industries and all firms, not just a few tech firms. And last thing I'll just say is I think this is really an important issue is two things here. Culture matters. The US has a tradition of free speech. If I want to go online right now after this and download a copy of Mein Kampf in the PDF form, I can do it. Now, if I'm in Germany, I can't do it, at least legally. And look, neither one is right nor wrong. That one fits for the German society, and this one fits for the American society. So we have to be careful there with sort of imposing one set of values on everybody else in the world. And the last thing I'll say is I do think it makes a difference what kind of country or you're in. If you're in a rich country like Estonia or the US, then yeah, certain rules and regulations might apply. But if you're in a poorer country, a developing country like India, maybe the focus should be more on how do you get more people using this? How do you get more adoption? In some way, regulation is a first world problem. It's something that we can do because we've got a lot of money and we don't mind imposing costs on businesses or consumers as much. So I'll stop there and I look forward to Marina's comments and the discussion.
Really interesting, Rob. I really take your point on, there's there's no one size fits all in this situation. A lot of different companies, every company is a tech company these days. So what are we talking about? And as well as the economic distinction. So we'll get into some of those, I think. Marina, what does it look like from Brussels these days and when you're in Brussels?
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Rob. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today and discuss the topics. And Bruce, thanks so much for putting Estonian flag on the wall behind you. And Rob, thanks so much for saying kind words about Estonia. Yes, I'm privileged to live in a society which has had e-lifestyle now for more than 30 years. So, of course, when coming to Brussels and looking from the perspective of Brussels, I want Brussels to be much more quick, much more focused, much more digital, much more advanced, finally have its pan-European digital ID and things like that. But as to today's topic, I would argue that the corona crisis has even more emphasized it, but even before corona crisis, EU was at the crossroad of defining its future. And EU has been pretty ambitious with the present Commission under von der Leyen with its digital ambitions. My feeling is that Europe feels today we are the backyard or colony of digital US. The big companies are in the United States. Social media platforms that influence us on a daily basis are American. Startups that start in Europe for several reasons end up in Silicon Valley. So the fact is that Europe is not happy about that. And that's why I'm happy that we are finally becoming ambitious. We are finally starting to produce not only thinking, but also regulation on different topics. Well, with the Commission's digital strategy, with the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, data strategy, there are many documents that the EU is working at the moment. And the main aim is to be competitive in digital market, not to stop innovation, not to stop research and development, and also base our cooperation on the values and principles of the EU. And my final remark is that I see GDPR as a success story of the EU. It was heavily criticized on the other side of Atlantic. It was heavily criticized by companies, but today we see globally that even multi-companies, they are asking for better regulation in protection of personal data. So I think we've been successful in that field, and that creates good chance for Europe to be more competitive also in other fields and even be a standard introducer in other fields concerning social platforms, concerning internet governance, concerning standardization, and so on. So, and my final remark, EU alone can't do anything. To be successful internationally, you have to cooperate. And the natural partner is the United States. So I very much hope that through today's conversation, we can find differences in thinking, but we can also define the topics and subjects where our thinking is very much aligned and where we can and have to cooperate much more closely. Thank you.
Well, this is great. That's a great start. And you get right into a really interesting thing that I think about in this context is that it is a kind of a unique situation. We have these, the tech industry, however broadly you define it, really did grow up most strongly in the US. There are important European tech companies as well, but the center of it remains actually out here in California, in Silicon Valley. And those companies have not been regulated except for general business regulation. And even those regulations haven't always reached. And so they've always made the argument that well, you can't regulate us, it will suppress innovation. But I think the European approach is one that regulation can also promote innovation. And I think those words don't always translate well here on this side of the Atlantic. Rob?
A couple of things. One is historically, we have not regulated technology companies. We didn't regulate IBM. And we should probably remember, I'm actually just finishing up a fantastic book by my colleague James Cortada on the history of IBM, about 2 years old. But one of the things that's so striking about that book is this is the same conversation Europe was having back in 1960 because they were so weak. They had very few mainframe firms and IBM. And IBM, by the way, was kind of like Google. And they went over to Europe. They had tens of thousands of employees in Europe. They had factories all over the place in France and Switzerland and Germany. But in any case, there was a real concern that Europe was becoming a technology colony. And the reason Europe fell behind, frankly, was because they just were too small. The markets were too small. They were all competing like with the English computer company against IBM or the French computer company. And that's why what the Commission is trying to do now is so critical with really making that digital single market. That's in my view, the single most important thing Europe can do, because it lets their companies, whether they're starting in Estonia or Spain or wherever, get that scale they need.
In the EU, I would argue that we still do not have single market, not even digital, but regular single market. Because we have 27 jurisdictions, we have 27 bureaucracies. And for an Estonian company to move to Italy, just an example, I apologize, don't want to mention any other countries, I can mention any other countries, all 26. It's difficult because of the bureaucracy, because of the language restrictions, and so on. So where the European problem is, we have not grown into a single market as such yet. Now we have a chance to try to introduce digital single market. Is it going to be easy? No. When Rob brought the examples of how privacy rules can stop using data for health or medical purposes, we have examples in Estonia. For a couple of weeks, we were not able to introduce digital vaccination program because of privacy rules. But here I want to say, come on, there is also common sense. Yes, bad regulation is not good, and too much regulation is not good. But at the same time, I have the feeling that there is a need for regulation, both more regulation, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. Bruce, you read the position of the judge, yes, Supreme Court judge, but there are also initiatives to regulate, to propose a creation of an authority in charge of platform regulation. If I'm not mistaken, please correct me. So at this moment, I have the feeling that there is understanding on both sides of the Atlantic that we have to regulate specific things that distort market. And from European perspective, we have been always very sensitive about competition. We have always taken it much more seriously, maybe, than the United States. And the second point, fundamental rights, and let's say the democratic scrutiny of social media platforms, we are also maybe taking it more seriously than in the United States. But look at the behavior of Facebook, of Twitter, when former President Trump's tweets were blocked. It raised many questions also in Europe. Is it right that a private company makes these decisions? Or should there be a public authority, public scrutiny, or should there be some regulation how to handle cases like that? So I think we are at the point where regulation is not the bad word.
Let's go back to this question about basically free speech and the problem that we have in America, a unique problem, because we have the First Amendment, of course, which applies to what governments do, but companies are not actually bound by it. And so we get into this weird situation where the government can't regulate speech, but companies have the ability to do so through their terms of service. And so it's upside down, if you will, because that is a public kind of good. And yet that's kind of the way the structure is. And so that's, I think, what Justice Thomas was talking to when he said we need to look at how our laws and our legal structure can deal with this question. But Rob, sure you've thought about this. What's your view?
Yeah, so this for folks who follow this in the U.S., this is all around what's called Section 230, which is a section of the 96 Telecommunications Act, and it does a number of things, but it basically gives platforms immunity if they take things down. And some other things. And we just issued a big 5-part series on Section 230 and what it is and all that stuff. But to Marina's point, these companies are damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. At least in the US, they're totally criticized by the left. How come you let Trump stay up so long? How come you're letting his son tweet? And then they're criticized from the right, which Justice Thomas is a quite conservative Supreme Court justice. Why are you taking down these conservative speech? So in some ways, there's really no good answer for this question. Let's assume we want to have government regulation. You know how many tweets? I'm on the content advisory body for TikTok, a very interesting group of academics and people. I don't know the number, but the number of TikTok videos that go up every hour, hundreds of thousands. And they do have a very robust content moderation system, as does Facebook, as does Google, as does Twitter, and they use AI. Hard for me to imagine how government would do that. So government couldn't, in my view, shouldn't be in the business. Okay, well, this tweet will allow, and this tweet we won't allow, because that's very easily politicized. But the question is, what do we do with these other companies? I think what my own view is it's a law is not quite the right thing. We need some sort of social guidance that we give them. These are the times you could take down a head of state, or we could say you can never take down a head of state. That could be another answer, no matter what the head of state does. But I think we have to give companies some guidance. Right now they're doing the best they can, and they're going to make somebody mad no matter who it is. But I don't think government involvement in a direct way is the right answer either.
Well, it's the companies certainly don't like being in this position of making these quasi-judicial decisions. There's huge questions about liability and things like that that come up. So, but on the other hand, you're absolutely right. The government could not, at least our government could certainly not do this on a retail basis. But that's where you're right, Marina, one of the things that's under consideration, I think there's dozens of bills in the Congress right now that are addressing this various ways, but one of them would create kind of a central regulatory authority, which would cut across the jurisdictions of different existing regulatory bodies and try to lump these companies together in some way. And one of the interesting things I think about the European approach is it does differentiate between intermediate service providers, between platform companies, and between what it calls very large platform companies. So what's been the response to those kind of paired acts, the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act so far? What are you hearing, and what's the mood in Brussels?
Bruce, I'd like to jump back for a second to the removal of content, because I think that Europe has been pretty good here in defining. First of all, when we talk about terrorist content, we have defined that. What is terrorist content? There is a difference between illegal content and harmful content, which is legal. And the mechanisms of removal are different. terrorist content removal within 1 hour and cross-border effect with the right of the competent authority in the host service provider's country to have an oversight and interfere. Illegal, yes, we have 27 different jurisdictions, but illegal can be illegal in the country of jurisdiction. So if, for example, if I talk about abortions are legal in Estonia, not legal in Poland today. We have different jurisdictions, which makes it more difficult. But it's very clear that illegal content has to be removed, and that's regulated. As to the harmful but legal content, yes, there is no regulation, and it's very much the self-regulation that Rob mentioned. And yes, we are looking towards social platforms and big tech. How do they handle that? Of course, there are some principles when you remove the content that you have to follow. No general monitoring obligation is one of the basic ones. Yes, you can use AI. Yes, you can take advantage of that, but the final decision has to be made by human, because you have your constitutional amendments, we have the fundamental right, freedom of speech, and nobody wants the content to be removed if it interferes with the freedom of speech. Now, briefly coming to the two acts, Digital Markets Act and Digital Service Act. They were proposed by Commission relatively recently. So the Parliament is only starting to look into them. All the different committees of Parliament will give their assessment. So even if I'm very optimistic, I do not see that they will be adopted until end of 22, beginning of 23. So it would be great if by the end of the term of this Parliament and this Commission will be ready to adopt the regulations.
Marina said, I think this is a very important distinction many people get wrong. There's a difference between illegal and legal but harmful. Companies have a responsibility to obey the law in any country that they don't even have to have employment in a country. As long as they're advertising their platform and pushing it, if you will, or supporting it, they have legal nexus and they should abide by whatever those laws are. Even frankly, in the Chinese case, I mean, we all know, well, you shouldn't apply with Chinese laws. Well, why do you get to not pick you don't like the Chinese laws because of human rights? It's their laws. So my point is, one of the things that I think we need to do there are some things that could be made illegal and should be made illegal. For example, in the US, we've pushed for what's called revenge pornography to be made illegal at the national level. If it's online, companies then have a legal responsibility to take it down. But things like just saying, hey, I think somebody's an idiot or something because of this or that, that's harmful, but it's not illegal, and it's a different issue. So if we're going to have rules, they should apply to basically everybody in the ecosystem. Now, to Marina's point, it's a little, we can come back to that later. Platforms are a little different because of size and power. I get that. But sort of broad general rules like privacy or data, those to me should apply to everybody. My data with a small firm is just as valuable with a big firm.
I made the difference only in the context of the Digital Markets Act. When Europe looks at the digital market today, we see that the market is being influenced by a number of big companies, and it's being influenced not in the positive sense. And for Europe, it has always been very important, the structure of the market and the work of the single market. So that's why the Digital Markets Act makes difference, but only for core platform services, full stop. Sometimes I have the feeling that we forget that we are writing these laws and regulations for people. They have to be people-centered. For me, the key question is trust. Very often, we do not trust governments, but somehow we trust giving our data to smaller companies. So why I think my country has been so successful with digital services, online services, e-services, is exactly that. For, I don't know what are the reasons, but there is a trust towards government. And as long as there is trust, governments can introduce services and people use them. But we need educated people when we start talking about data collection, use of data, reuse of data. We are producing huge amounts of data on a daily, on an hourly, on a minutely basis. And we're not taking advantage of that. And that's why we need also the regulation of data market. And people, they have to have much better knowledge of what kind of data they are themselves producing, what kind of data there is about them, how can they decide, let's say the same data altruism, because we need a consumer who understands what's happening to the data.
I want to use the last part of our time here to discuss the possibilities of cooperation across the Atlantic. Are there any ways that we can work together better? I think one, as Marina mentioned, really the GDPR has become a global standard because all global companies have to meet that higher bar. And so out here in California, of course, we have a very strong Privacy Act that is very similar to the GDPR. But what's going to happen in this case with these, where the stakes are even higher in some ways, the economic and political stakes are even higher. Are you seeing any appetite for cooperation on the European side, Marina? I mean, it's U.S.-European cooperation on privacy has been difficult.
Yes, I agree that let's say the last 5 years have been difficult for closer cooperation between EU and US. It's not only digital topics, it's foreign policy, it's on almost every topic. Do I see the light at the end of the tunnel? I have to say that from the Parliament's perspective, yes. Because I had the privilege of serving on my personal note, I had the privilege of serving as Estonian ambassador to Washington, DC during President Obama's second administration, which means that the people who are now in power, President Biden's administration, many of them are familiar to us. We know them, they are predictable, we trust them, we know how to cooperate with them. I think that Europe has also made its first moves. And for example, in December already, the Commission and the High Representative for Foreign Affairs called for the establishment of EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which is supposed to replace the, for today, dead TTIP, yeah? And the council should look at topics from responsibility of online platforms, fair taxation, market distortion, cooperation on standards, common approach to critical technologies, including AI, data flows, and so on. So I see there is a momentum. Yes, unfortunately, we have had now a number of European Court of Justice rulings that say that the present US protection mechanisms are not enough. And it's a problem, because it creates questions, it creates mistrust, it creates radicals who want to talk about very strong European sovereignty, not the liberal one, but the one going very close to protectionism. There are ones who are talking about data localization. And I would argue that it's very much because we can't start normally working on exchange of data, which is safe, secure, and follows the maybe too high, but the standards of the EU. So
I think one of the big challenges, though, is really misunderstanding. There's misunderstanding on the US side of what Europe is actually doing and kind of overstating the harm. There's also misunderstanding the other way. The last time I was in Brussels before the COVID shutdown or limitations, I was talking to a commission official at a lunch, and he was just really going after me. The US, you don't tax these companies, there's no regulation, net neutrality, there's no antitrust. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, yeah, we actually do. FTC is a Federal Trade Commission, a very strong agency. We have brought multiple cases against companies for privacy violations. Our FCC has brought net neutrality cases, our antitrust. But I understood where he was coming from, which is he was under a certain view of what the US was. It was almost like a cartoon. It wasn't real.
Right. And sometimes, even if we want to cooperate with some countries, I'm not going to name them, we are stuck by we run against the wall of applicability of international law, of humanitarian law, and the same principles and values that our transatlantic relations are based on. But as to transatlantic relations, very optimistic. India doing great advantages. Sometimes we joke that we have the same number of population, 1.3. just some zeros missing. So I think that India and Estonia are very much on the same line. And so, Rob, if you write the next book, it can be small is beautiful. But thank you so much. It was a pleasure to listen to you, to talk to you, and I learned a lot.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Rob. And thanks all of you out there in TV land for paying attention to our conversation today.